welcome to Experimental Psychology, Psych 224. Once again, we're going to learn about experimentation. In the previous sessions, I've talked a lot about experimental designs. Now, this section, which is session 9, is going to be slightly different because this time I'm going to talk about non-experimental designs, otherwise referred to as descriptive research methodology. So in psychology, it's not every research that we can use the experimental design to conduct. So there are instances where it may not be practical, or it may not be ethical or physical or feasible to conduct a study using experimentation. It is not always the case that we'll be able to manipulate independent variables and measure the effect on the dependent variable. And these are instances where we'll resort to using the non-experimental research methods. And that is what I'm going to talk about in this session. So by the end of this session, you should be able to discuss the basic characteristics of descriptive research methods. You should be able to list the various descriptive research methods and explain them as well. You should be able to identify when to use each of these descriptive research methods. And finally, you should know about the strengths and the weaknesses of the various research methods. So in a nutshell, these are the topics I'm going to cover. Why use descriptive research methodology? And then I'll talk about the types, and I've put that in 2 parts. This is your reading list for this session. So let's start now. Why descriptive research methodology? So why do we use the descriptive research methodology? Again, according to Hyman, 1995, descriptive research methods are used, first of all, to test hypotheses that predict that a relationship exists. They are used to describe a behavior or subject. They are used to discover relationships, and also they are used to predict behavior. So for instance, if we are testing hypotheses to predict the relationships that exist between variables, we may want to, for example, assess motivation at the workplace and performance, because we want to find out that a relationship exists between motivating employees and their performance. So this type of research methodology involves studying people as they lead their lives in order to describe their behavior and mental processes. So you study individuals in their natural environment. So here, the variables of interest are not manipulated. No external variables are introduced. No variables are manipulated. You study the individuals as they lead their lives. So with descriptive research methodology, the aim is not to establish a cause-effect relationship. It's to find out whether associations exist among variables, for instance. So what it means is that the researcher cannot manipulate the independent variable. And sometimes that is the reason why we would use this kind of methodology. The fact that the researcher cannot manipulate the independent variable. So there are instances where it is not possible for the researcher to manipulate the independent variable as he or she would in an experimental design. And so the non-experimental design or descriptive research methodology is used. Another reason why we would use this methodology is that sometimes there are studies where it is practically impossible to conduct a study, an experimental study. So let's say, for instance, we want to find out students' perception about a school feeding program, where, as I mentioned in one of the sessions, the Vice Chancellor wants to introduce students having one balanced or one square meal in a day. So you pay for a meal a day, and then it's part of your school fees, and each day you go to the cafeteria to obtain your meal. Now, if we want to find out about students' attitude towards such a phenomena, we cannot use the experimental study. We would have to give our questionnaires to participants to find out their opinion, to find out their perception about this particular phenomenon. Sometimes also, there are instances where the study that we want to conduct, manipulating independent variables, can cause physical or psychological harm to the participants that are involved. So for instance, if let's say we want to find out the effect of drug use on people's behavior, in this case, drug use is the independent variable. So we select a specific drug, like marijuana. Are we going to say that we are going to give this drug to the participants to take and then measure the effect it will have on them? Obviously, this can cause psychological harm to them. So in this case, we'll just have to find people who have already been involved in being on drugs, and then we assess them. Again, sometimes we use this descriptive research methodology because these studies are very informational. So they are designed to gain more information about a phenomenon in the real world. For instance, we can obtain information about voting behavior. So we know that come November or December, we'll be having elections in Ghana. We can find out what people's perception is about the outcome of these coming elections, or we can get an idea about the voting trend by giving out questionnaires or conducting a survey to find out from people that if they are to vote come November or December, who would they vote for? Based on their responses, we can predict that, given that nothing changes, this is the person that would have as president in November or December. So descriptive studies also give us a lot of information. Now let me go on and talk about each of these studies in detail. So I put them in two parts. I'll talk about the first three and talk about the rest of them in the second part. So I'm going to talk about case studies, archival studies, and the survey method. So let's look at case studies. I'm sure you've heard about this before. You may have done it in your previous courses. So basically, it's an intense description and analysis of a single individual or a setting, such as an organization, a neighborhood, a community, an event, etc. So one individual or a case, as it is put, because sometimes it's a school or a neighborhood that you are investigating, that particular case is studied in depth. So this kind of study focuses on all aspects of a single individual or a selected group of individuals. So if you talk about, let's say, studying a school, it's not about studying the various individuals in the school, but basically the school as a whole, maybe the infrastructure, maybe the way the students behave, etc., etc. So you study that school in depth. So information is obtained for a case study from various sources, such as interviews, such as psychological test results, etc., etc. So a typical example is a description of a patient by a clinical psychologist. So clinical psychologists use this study very often. Now, a strength of this study is the fact that it is informational, because remember, you are studying one individual or one case in depth. So it gives you a lot of information. It also allows for rare or unusual problems to be studied. Again, it allows the researcher to be able to obtain information about a single case. Remember, I mentioned the fact that you take one case and you study it in depth. However, this case study has some weaknesses. And the first is the fact that there's no control group for comparison. Remember, in the experimental research methodologies, I talk about the fact that it's important to have a control group. Now, this is the case where you have a case study, you're studying one single individual or a single case. So whatever conclusions that you draw, you don't have a control group to compare your findings with. Another disadvantage is the fact that a case study can be misleading, because you're studying one case, you're studying one individual, and this individual is not representative of the whole population. The other disadvantage or weakness is the fact that the researcher relies on the memories of individuals. So if, let's say, you are studying a particular individual with a rare psychological illness, you are interviewing this individual, this person may have a distorted memory, or it's possible that the individual will tell you about positive events that have occurred and then ignore unpleasant events that they don't want to talk about. So you may not get all the information that you require. Now the second one is the archival method. And this examines already existing records. So with the archival method, you are not testing participants. You basically resort to using historical accounts of events. So it could be studying journal articles, police crime reports, etc., etc. So events that have occurred already that have been reported on, and you are studying these events. So as I said, no live participant is being tested in the archival study. If, for instance, we want to study past presidents, we want to study the extent to which they upheld democracy, these past presidents may not exist any longer. So we go into the archives and take records of activities of these past presidents and we study them. So a strength of this method is the fact that it allows us to assess phenomena that otherwise may not be studied. So talking about studying past presidents, these past presidents may not be alive, but we have their memoirs, we have records of events that were involved in, etc., and we study those. A weakness is the fact that the accuracy and appropriateness of the data depends entirely on those who created the records. So what this means is that the researcher is using data that he or she did not collect. So for instance, being a psychologist, you know that when you are collecting data, there are some variables that you have to control for in order to collect accurate data. However, with the records for archival method, what happens is that you are relying on, for instance, newspaper reports, police reports, etc. And whilst these people were writing these reports, they may have done it in a non-scientific way. They collected this information without thinking about the fact that perhaps it may be used for research one day. So you are actually at the mercy of those who collected the data. And this data, as I said, may not have been collected using a scientific procedure. Then finally, sometimes you may not have access to every information that you need. Take, for instance, trying to get information from the police. There's some information that they may want to protect, so they will not make it available to the general public. So it means that you won't have that information to draw your conclusions on. The third one is the survey method. And this is collecting standardized information by administering questionnaires or interviewing a representative sample of a population. So a group of individuals are asked carefully worded questions. I'm sure all of you, in one time or the other, have responded to a questionnaire before. So that is what a survey involves. You are given carefully worded questions to respond to. Depending on the kind of questionnaire it is, it may have different responses, or the response rates may vary. So surveys are used to explore people's attitudes, people's opinions, their beliefs, etc., etc., in their natural setting. Remember, I gave the example of finding out voting behavior. So we'll use a survey to find out who people are likely to vote for and why they are likely to vote for those individuals. The strength of this method, which is the survey method, is the fact that we can use it to predict behavior. So when you talk about voting behavior, you can use it to predict that come November or December, this is the trend that the voting will take. Again, with this method, information can be obtained from a large group of individuals. So imagine I want to find out your knowledge about, let's say, cancer. So I come to class, and then there are about 200 of you, and then I administer questionnaires. So within a matter of 30 minutes or so, I'll be able to collect information from a large number of individuals. And so it allows the researcher to collect data, a large amount of data in a relatively short time. However, a weakness is the fact that sometimes it's difficult to obtain a representative sample. So I talked about administering questionnaires to you. You may not be a representative sample of DE students or DE psychology students. So that is the challenge with this kind of design. Another challenge is the fact that sometimes the responses that participants make may not be accurate. So they could just decide to take one kind of response throughout, or they may lie about the responses that they make. Now, there are several types of surveys, so I'll quickly go through these several types and ask you to read more about them. So we have the mail survey, we have the telephone survey, the group administration, face-to-face interviews, and internet survey. So briefly about the mail survey. So this is when the researcher would mail in terms of post the questionnaires to participants for them to complete. And a researcher will usually use this method if he or she wants to collect data from a large sample, or if the questionnaire is a lengthy one, so you would send it to people in their homes to complete. So it means that when you post the questionnaires, you have to add a self-addressed envelope so that when the participants complete the questionnaires, they will post it back to you. The problem with this type of survey is the fact that the return rate is low. So you may post out 100 questionnaires and you may get only 40 or 50 people responding and returning them to you. The other one is the telephone survey, where you would actually phone people and then ask them the questions on your questionnaire. So the researcher will read the questions over the phone and the participants will respond to the questions. The response rate for this kind of survey is high because sometimes when you get people on the phone, it's difficult for them to say no or to decline participation. So you have more people responding than you would have if you had posted the questionnaires to them. The only thing is the fact that it can be time consuming, and sometimes you have to be very clear on the phone so that people can hear what you are saying. Another survey method is the group administration, where you administer the questionnaire to a group of participants. So I gave an example where I come to class and I administer questionnaires on voting behavior on all 200 students that are in class, for instance. In this case, I'm able to collect a lot of information at a sitting. However, sometimes when it's a group administration, participants don't feel like they have the privacy and confidentiality to respond to these items. So you are sitting so close to each other, the person sitting to your left or your right can see your responses. And so you may not write the true responses, or you may not respond to the questionnaire as truly as you would want to because people are looking over your shoulder. Sometimes also people feel that they are being compelled to respond to these questionnaires, and so you have negative attitude setting in. Then you have the face-to-face interview, also another survey method. So with the face-to-face survey, it involves a face-to-face interaction with the participants. So the experimenter has a face-to-face interaction with the participant. It could involve using structured interviews or unstructured interviews. So you use structured interviews where you have a set of questions that you are asking all the participants. So that way it is standardized. The only problem is that there's no flexibility because you have to stick to the questions that you have to ask the participants. On the other hand, you can have unstructured interviews where the researcher would gain information and then ask more questions. So based on the question you ask a participant, you ask further questions based on the responses that they make. So in as much as there's flexibility, when it comes to coding the responses for analysis, that becomes a problem because different participants may be saying different things about the same issue. So you would need more time to do the coding of such data. The final one is the internet survey, where the researcher will post the questionnaires on the internet and then participants will respond to these items electronically. So it could be open-ended questions or closed-ended questions that are posted. Sometimes also, the researcher will use the internet to solicit for respondents or participants, and those who express interest, he would send them the questionnaires to complete online. So I've been involved in studies where I have responded to questionnaires on the net. These days, some researchers will even put it on Facebook and encourage their friends on Facebook to click on the link and respond to the questions. A lot of times you have researchers using what you call surveymonkey.com. So you can use surveymonkey.com to design your questionnaire and put it online and make it electronic for participants to respond to. So let's go to the second part of descriptive research methodology. So here I'll talk about the rest of the research methods. I'll talk about the correlational research method, naturalistic observation, developmental research designs, and the qualitative research design. So with a correlational study, it is used to assess and specify the relationship between two existing traits, two behaviors, two events, etc. So the researcher will measure two or more variables and then find out using a statistical tool how related these variables are. So you can study as many variables as you can, but note that when you run your statistical analysis, correlation compares just two variables at a time. Now, the relationship that you study in correlation is referred to as correlation coefficient, and you can have three different types of correlation coefficient. You have positive correlation, negative correlation, and zero correlation. And I've explained that. So with positive correlation, an increase in the measure of one variable leads to an increase in the measure of another variable. So for example, we may find that as motivation increases, performance also increases, or productivity also increases. Or as motivation decreases, then performance also decreases. So let me point out that it's not just an increase in one variable leading to an increase in the other, but also the reverse is true. A decrease in one variable leads to a decrease in the other variable. Now, negative correlation acts in opposite directions. So an increase in one variable will lead to a decrease in the other variable being studied. So for instance, an increase in education reduces the extent to which people get ill. So let's say as knowledge increases, the tendency of falling ill will reduce, or as education increases, the tendency of, for instance, getting infected with cholera reduces. That's a negative correlation. Then with zero correlation, there's no relationship between the variables that are being studied. This is just to show you when I mentioned the fact that correlation compares two variables at a time. So this is a typical example of an analysis that has been done, and the figures have been put in the table. So if you look at it, you have demand for success belief, self-reproach belief, need for fairness belief, and then desire for success belief. So these are beliefs to do with eating for people with diabetes. And so you notice that it's labeled 1 to 4. So on the left-hand side, you have these variables labeled 1 to 4, and at the top of the table, you also have 1 to 4 representing these 4 variables. So if you look at it, it compares two variables at a time. A strength of this study is the fact that it's able to demonstrate the relationship that exists between two variables. And you can also determine whether this relationship is positive or negative. The other thing also is the fact that you're able to determine the magnitude of the relationship. So correlation, the magnitude of the correlation ranges from 0, it ranges from 0.1 to 0.9. A magnitude of 1, it means that it's an absolute relation, there's an absolute relationship. But where you have it ranging from 1 to 3, 0.1 to 0.3, that means that the relationship is weak. If you have a relationship that ranges from 0.4 to 0.5. You have a relationship that ranges from 0.4 to 0.6. That is a moderate relationship. And then 0.7 to 0.9 is a very strong relationship. So let me just take you back to the table I showed you. You notice that you have, for the correlation, you have 0.40, you have 0.3, you have 0.29, etc. So that is the magnitude of the relationship. So it doesn't just tell you the relationship between the variables, but also how strong the relationship is. A weakness of this method is the fact that the researcher is not able to establish a cause-effect relationship. It only establishes the association that exists between the variables being studied, and not whether variable A causes B or vice versa. Then we have the naturalistic observation, where participants are observed in their natural environment without controlling any variables or manipulating any variables. So, for instance, a researcher could observe children in a daycare center. A researcher could observe shoppers in a shopping mall during Christmas. A researcher could observe animals in their natural habitat, etc., etc. So basically, the aim of this research, this kind of methodology, is to observe participants in their natural setting as they behave naturally without influencing their behavior. When participants are aware that they are being observed, sometimes they change their behavior, and that's a problem with this kind of method, and it's referred to as the observer effect. So to reduce that, you conceal the observer. So perhaps you rather use a hidden camera to record the behavior of the shoppers in the mall, rather than having somebody sit somewhere looking at them and observing them. That could let them change their behavior. A strength of this method is the fact that it gives insight into how behavior can occur in the natural world. Remember, we are not manipulating anything, we are not changing anything, we are just observing people in their natural setting. And because we do that, we are able to achieve high external validity. A weakness of this method is the fact that it can be time-consuming and expensive. So if you have to sit and observe children playing, you have to observe people in a shopping mall, etc., etc. You want to observe animals in their natural habitat. Sometimes you want to see how, maybe in the animal kingdom, you want to find out what happens when one animal attacks another animal. You have to wait for that event to occur to see how the other animals around would behave. Would they run away, or would they come to the rescue of the one that is being attacked? So sometimes this method can be time-consuming. And then you have what you call the observer bias also setting in, where sometimes the observer who is recording the behaviors may be biased. So he may record some behaviors that would answer his research questions and not record ones that will not answer his research questions. So another descriptive research method is the developmental research method. And basically, this method involves evaluating changes in behavior that takes place over time. So the major variable here is age. As people age, how do they change? You measure that on several variables. So for example, if you take language development, as children grow and as they age, how does language develop? How does language development progress, etc., etc. Now, there are two common types of developmental research designs. These are the correlational research design and then the longitudinal research design. So let's look at the cross-sectional. Here, participants of different ages are observed. So you have the researcher taking a cross-section of participants from the population and then studies this cross-section of individuals. So if we want to find out how intelligence varies with age, we will take people who are 5 years, people who are 10 years, people who are 15 years, etc., and study these individuals at one point in time. So with the correlational With a cross-sectional study, you study these individuals at one point in time. A strength of this method is the fact that it can be conducted quickly and easily because you study these different groups of individuals of different ages at one point in time. However, a weakness is the fact that you can have what you call generational or cohort effect. You can have generational or cohort effect setting in. So what this means is that if you are studying people of different ages, because they belong to different cohorts, so people of 25 years, people who are 25 years differ from people who are 75 years because they belong to different generations. So their perceptions about certain issues may vary because they belong to different generations, and that can affect the outcome of the study. And that is what we refer to as cohort effect. Then we have the longitudinal study, where a single group of participants are followed over a period of time. So note the difference between a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study. With a longitudinal study, you can take people who are age 5 and then observe them over a period of time up to when perhaps they turn 35 years. So you study them over 30 years. So whatever variable you are interested in investigating, you would measure that behavior when the children are 10 years, when they are 15 years, 20 years, etc. So using 5 years intervals. So it's the same group of participants you are investigating over a period of time. Now, when you take the cross-sectional study, you study different groups of individuals of different ages at one point in time. So you can say that a cross-sectional study is a between-participant design because you have different groups of individuals, while a longitudinal study studies one group of individuals at different times. So that can qualify as a within-participant study because the same group of individuals are being studied at different times. A strength of the longitudinal study is the fact that you don't have the cohort effect occurring because it's the same people you are studying over time, so they belong to the same generation. If history acts as an extraneous variable, it will affect all the individuals that you are testing. Again, it permits the researcher to see how a particular variable changes over time because you are studying the same group of individuals. So for instance, how does language develop over time? A weakness of this study is the fact that you can have what you call the cross-sectional effects occurring. Now, I want you to note the difference. With the cross-sectional study, I said that you have the cohort or generational effect occurring. With the longitudinal study, you have the cross-generational effect occurring. You have the cross-generational effect occurring. Basically, what this means is that if, let's say, you study people age 5 over a period of time, or let me use this example. You study people, individuals were studied in the 70s. We wanted to find out the special bond between mothers and their children. So we studied these individuals in the 1970s and followed them till 1980 when the children were age 10. Whatever findings that we obtain from this study, we may not be able to generalize it to people in recent times. So maybe in recent times, 2006, 2016. So if, let's say, at the end of our study in 1980, we found out that the bond that develops between a mother and a child is as a result of the presence of the mother in the home all the time. And so we conclude that mothers should be at home all the time with their children. It should be housewives, like was done in those days, to be able to form special bonds with their children. This is what we found in 1980. We cannot generalize this in our present times, 2006, where things have changed, where most women have become career women, where the economy is such that you need both parents working. So you can't have a mother stay at home 24/7. So that is what you refer to as the cross-generational effect. What you may find with one generation, you may not be able to generalize to another generation. Again, you can have the carryover effect occurring. Remember, this is a within participant design, so a carryover effect can occur, and you can have mortality also occurring. Those group of individuals you are studying, some of them can choose to drop out of the study, or they can die, so you lose them. And this study can also be very time consuming. So finally, we have the qualitative research method. This definition, you see, is quite a long one, but I like it because it incorporates everything about a qualitative research. So Creswell, 1994, defines qualitative research as an inquiry process of understanding a social or human problem based on building a complex, holistic picture formed with words, reporting detailed views of information, and conducted in a natural setting. That is quite a mouthful, but if you break it down, for me, it just covers everything about a qualitative research. So basically, with qualitative research, you may interview participants, you may ask participants to keep diaries for which you will use for analysis. You may interview groups of individuals, which we call focus groups, etc. And then based on that, you analyze your interviews, etc., and draw your conclusions. So you get in-depth information about a particular phenomena. And when you write your report, you actually quote what the individuals say, so that it really represents whatever findings that you come out with. So qualitative research method is used to better understand phenomenon that very little is known about. So sometimes you are conducting a study that very little has been done in that area. So you use the qualitative method to obtain more information, because as I said, you get in-depth information when you use the qualitative method. It is also used to gain a new perspective on things about which much is already known. So we know a lot about same-sex relationship, but we want to gain a new perspective, so we conduct qualitative studies. It's also used to gain more in-depth information about something that may be difficult to convey quantitatively. So when we talk about quantitative data, let's say you administer questionnaires to individuals and then they give their responses, but you notice that perhaps if you had asked them why they responded the way they responded, you would have obtained more information. So in this case, you may choose to follow up with a qualitative research to obtain more information. It's also used to understand behavior in the natural setting. It is used to understand a phenomenon from the perspective of the researcher. So if, let's say, you are studying people who have developed cancer, qualitative research method would help you to get in-depth information about how these people who have been affected with cancer feel about the illness. So Creswell lists several methods that you can use when you are doing qualitative research. There are 5 major ones. So the biography, case study, ethnography, grounded theory, then we have what we call phenomenology. An example is the interpretative phenomenological analysis, what is popularly known as IPA. So I will encourage you to read more about these various types of qualitative research method. So this brings us to the end of this session, where I have talked about the descriptive research methodologies. I've mentioned that these are also called non-experimental research methods, because the method that we use is non-experimental, as the name suggests. We observe participants in their natural setting without manipulating any variables or controlling any variables.